Welcome everyone who joined us today. My name is Sabine Ekman. I'm the Director and Chief Curator here at the Mildred Kemper Art Museum at Washington University. It is my pleasure today to welcome Professor Michael Rothberg from UCLA and Professor Annika Walke here from Washington University. Unfortunately, Professor Jeff Ward, who also wanted to join us for the conversation today, had to cancel due to a family illness. I am very much looking forward to Michael Rothberg's lecture on multidirectional memory, implicated subjects, and the possibility of art. Our afternoon, morning, or early evening, depending from where you listen to us, will begin with his lecture and is followed by a Q&A with Annika Walke, after which we will open the discussion to the public. The program is a collaboration among the Mildred Kemper Art Museum, the Center for the Humanities at Washington University, and the Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Equity. Today's lecture and conversation will focus on histories of violence and injustice that we all have inherited in one way or the other. It will explore conceptions of memory that are inclusive of different cultures and national legacies. However, these are still frequently, and even with compassion, conceived as incompatible, such as post-colonialism and anti-Semitic studies. Michael Rothberg will discuss these complex and complicated issues that acutely move the past into the present and demonstrate how they are mediated in artworks by William Kentridge and Hitu Style. There were many good reasons for us to invite Michael Rothberg to give his lecture and engage with us in a conversation. His project draws connections to Memory for the Future, a Washington University initiative that combines critical memory studies with curatorial and public education project. His lecture also resonates with Mildred Kemper Art Museum exhibitions, which have addressed the vicissitudes of memory and afterlives of histories of violence through several projects such as Ai Weiwei, Bare Life, To See Without Being Seen, Contemporary Art and Drone Warfare, in which Hitu Style was included, and In the Aftermath of Trauma, Contemporary Video Installation. Most recently, Jeff Ward curated Truth and Reckonings, the Art of Transformative Racial Justice here at the museum as well, to increase the visibility and impact of his own anti-racist work. Lastly, I should acknowledge that William Kentridge received the Dean's Medal from the Sam Fox School in 2011. And with that, I would like to introduce the speakers. Since 2016, Michael Rothberg is the 1939 Society Samuel Goetz Chair in Holocaust Studies and Professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of California, Los Angeles. From 2001 to 2016, he taught at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, first as associate professor and then as professor of English. From 2009 to 2016, he was the founding director of the Initiative in Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies. Rothberg works in the fields of Holocaust studies, trauma and memory studies, critical theory and cultural studies, post-colonial studies, and contemporary literatures. He's on the editorial board of the journals Memory Studies and Studies in American Jewish Literature. He's a founding member of the advisory board of the Memory Studies Association and a partner of the Network in Transnational Memory Studies and Mnemonics, Networks for Memory Studies. Rothberg's academic work has been published in such journals as American Literary History, Contemporary Literature, Critical Inquiry, Cultural Critique, History and Memory, History and Theory, New German Critique, and PMLA. And his work has been translated into French, German, Hungarian, Polish, and Spanish. He has also published articles on current political issues in the online venue Open Democracy. His essay, Progress, Progression, Procession, William Kentridge and the Narratology of Transitional Justice, won the 2013 prize for Best Essay in Narrative from the International Society of Study of Narrative. Rothberg's latest book is The Implicated Subject, Beyond Victims and Perpetrators, published by Stanford University Press in August of 2019 in their Cultural Memory in the Present series. His previous book include Multidirectional Memory, Remembering the Holocaust in the Age of Decolonization, and Traumatic Realism, The Demands of Holocaust Representation. He's also the co-editor of several volumes that address the Holocaust, multidirectional memory, and postcolonialism. Currently, Rothberg is completing a book with Jasmine Yildiz, I hope I not mispronounced her name, that focuses on the intersection between migration, citizenship, and confrontation with National Socialism and the Holocaust in contemporary Germany. Annika Walke is Associate Professor of History at Washington University in St. Louis, with affiliations in International and Area Studies, Jewish, Islamic, and Middle Eastern Studies, and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Walke was educated at the University of Oldenburg, Germany, and the State University of St. Petersburg, Russia, before she completed her doctorate in the History of Consciousness department at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Annika's research and teaching interests include World War II and Nazi genocide, migration, nationality policies, and oral history in the former Soviet Union and Europe. Her book, Pioneer and Partisans, An Oral History of Nazi Genocide in Belarusia, was published with Oxford University Press in 2015. It weaves together oral histories, video testimonies, and memoirs to show how the first generation of Soviet Jews experienced the Nazi genocide and how they remember it after the dissolution of the USSR in 1991. A current research project is devoted to the long aftermath of the Holocaust and World War II in Belarus. Annika Walke is affiliated with the Holocaust Geographies Collaborative. She currently serves as a co-PI of the Holocaust Ghettos Project, reintegrating victims and perpetrators through places and events, an NEH-funded endeavor to develop a historical GIS of Nazi-era ghettos in Eastern Europe. And with this long introduction, I would like to turn the floor over to Michael Rothberg and his lecture, to which I'm very much looking forward now.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sabina Ekman, for the really kind introduction. Thank you for the introduction, also for the invitation, rather, also to Annika Walke and Jeff Ward. And I'm so sorry that Jeff is not able to be with us today, and I wish him and his family well. I'm grateful also to, of course, all the staff at the Kemper Museum for helping make this possible. So let me share my screen to get going here. What I want to do today is to sort of talk you through some of the issues that arise from these two books, Multidirectional Memory and The Implicated Subject. These are books that grow out of my interest in my work in Holocaust studies and my interest in Holocaust memory in particular, but also out of my long-standing efforts to bring Holocaust memory into contact with other histories of violence, including especially colonialism and slavery, and then more recently also South African apartheid and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And as I think many of you know, this dominant public image, at the very least, of the Holocaust is of the Holocaust's uniqueness and incomparability. But I see my project as really trying to open up careful comparisons that allow us to think about the Holocaust in relationship to these other histories without collapsing these histories into each other. So the talk today, I'm supposed to talk for about 30 minutes. Let me check my clock here. And we'll take you through the three sort of key terms of my title: multidirectional memories, implicated subjects, and the possibilities of art. And if possible, we'll have a short coda as well. So let me begin with the question of multidirectional memory. Multidirectional memory grew out of a question that I was posing myself, especially in the early 21st century, which is what happens when memories of different historical traumas confront each other in the public sphere. And at that moment, when I started to think about this issue, there was a sort of a way of thinking about this question, which emphasized especially what was called the competition of victims, right? And this kind of conflict between different victim groups for recognition of their particular histories. And I called this, especially when this competition had to do with history and historical memory, I called this competitive memory. And and I asked myself, is this really the way that memory works? And what I found was in these dominant discussions, a logic that I came to associate with the logic of the zero-sum game, which was the idea that if one historical memory is present in the public sphere, it must be pushing other ones out of the way, right? So if there was too much Holocaust memory, that means that there was not enough memory of slavery. Or if there was too much attention paid to slavery, that would somehow relativize or marginalize the Holocaust. And to give you an example of this kind of thinking, here's a quotation I work with at the beginning of the book from Walter Ben Michaels, who's a very prominent literary critic, and he likes to be provocative, and I think he's trying to be provocative here, but I think what he's expressing was actually a fairly widely held belief, and probably remains so. So this was thinking about the construction of the US Holocaust Museum in Washington and posing this question. He writes, commemoration of the Nazi murder of the Jews on the Mall was in fact another kind of Holocaust denial. Why should what the Germans did to the Jews be treated as a crucial event in American history, especially when, given the absence of any commemoration of American racism on the Mall, what Americans did to Black people is not. This was, of course, before the National Museum of African American History. And there's something to this, of course. I mean, it's clear that the Holocaust has a kind of prominence in our culture that we might also wish for other histories that have taken place within our national, right, in our national framework. But I asked myself, is this really the way that memory works? Is it really this kind of zero-sum game where if you remember one history, you're denying another? And I came to think that that really isn't the way that memory works. And in my book, Multidirectional Memory, I offer a whole series of examples, sort of counter examples that show that in fact, even when there's conflict between memories, that is a kind of productive conflict that brings, in fact, more memory and more memories of different events into consciousness, into the public sphere. And one of the first people that helped me to think along those lines was the great African-American intellectual and activist W.E.B. Du Bois. And particularly this essay that I discovered called The Negro and the Warsaw Ghetto, which was published in 1952 in a Jewish communist magazine called Jewish Life. And it's a report, a short report on a trip that Du Bois took to Warsaw in 1949, so very soon after the war. And it sort of reflects on what he experienced there and how that changed the way he thought about the history of race in the United States. So he wrote in this short piece, I have seen something of human upheaval in this world, the scream and shots of a race riot in Atlanta, the marching of the Ku Klux Klan, the threat of courts and police, the neglect and destruction of human habitation. But nothing in my wildest imagination was equal to what I saw in Warsaw in 1949. So he has this really kind of stunning, kind of shocking confrontation with post-war Warsaw, and in particular with the post-war Warsaw Ghetto, or the space that had been the Warsaw Ghetto. What was it that Du Bois actually saw, and what did he come to think of all of that? Well, he saw really a city that had been completely destroyed, right? That had been reduced to rubble, and especially the area of the ghetto, as he remarks. And he also saw Nathan Rappaport's famous Warsaw Ghetto Uprising Monument, which is a two-sided monument that kind of has a image of resistance on the front and an image of exilic suffering on the back. And one of my arguments is that this resonated with Du Bois's own famous ideas about double consciousness, that this monument presented an image in a way of a kind of double consciousness. But let me read also what he wrote here, and I'm trying to move my screen a little bit. The problem of slavery, emancipation, and caste in the United States was no longer in my mind a separate and unique thing as I had so long conceived it. The race problem in which I was interested cut across lines of color and physique and belief and status, and was a matter of cultural patterns, perverted teaching, and human hate and prejudice, which reached all sorts of people and caused endless evil to all men. So what interested me about Du Bois's essay, and what kind of moved me about Du Bois's essay, was that he was able to come to an understanding of the relationship between different histories of violence, which I would call multidirectional, which is to say that he was critical of his own tendency to have seen his own history of the experience of racism as something unique, as he puts it, and separate from other forms of racism. But at the same time, as you saw in that earlier slide, he also did not see these different histories that he saw relationally as equal to each other. He did not collapse them into each other. And it's this vision, this relational vision, which avoids, on the one hand, equalization of different histories, and on the other hand, the separation and sort of sacralization of different histories as unique, which I came to define as this multi-directional tradition. And I was able to trace this through various other texts, often having to do with the relationship between Black and Jewish history, but also, as I came to discover, other things, like, for example, the context of the Algerian War of Independence, in which people in France were experiencing what was happening, those who were opposed to the war, and sometimes those who were in fact in favor of the French war, were experiencing what was happening as a kind of echo of what had happened under Nazi occupation. So people talk about the torture that the French state was perpetrating at that moment as, in some ways, reminding them, echoing the torture that they had experienced from the Gestapo during the Second World War and the Nazi occupation. And so there's a whole kind of archive I came to see of these multi-directional articulations of memory in which different memories come together productively, not according to the logic of the zero-sum game, and not in order to collapse everything into one sort of a mass of violence, but rather a kind of differentiated relational vision of history. Now, after completing multidirectional memory, I started to think about different versions of multidirectionality. And I started especially to think about what happens when histories come together, not through a kind of common experience of victimization, but from other positions, right? So in the Du Bois case, he is experiencing Warsaw from the perspective of an African-American man who, as he says, has known his share of racist violence, right? And so he's making a link to Jewish suffering during the Holocaust from his own position of having experienced racism. But I started to wonder what happens when we shift the positions a little bit and don't only think about it in terms of different histories of victimization coming together. And I was inspired to do this partly by this novel, Austerlitz, by W.G. Sebald, which some of you may know. Sebald was, of course, a really important post-war German writer who in fact died in an accident shortly after this novel was published. He was based for a long time in the UK, taught at the university in England, but continued to write in German. And he published this novel, Austerlitz. And the novel is indeed the story of a victim. It's the story of Jacques Austerlitz, who as a child, a Jewish child, was sent from Prague on a kinder transport, right, by his parents to safety in the United Kingdom. And the novel is primarily a story about his attempts to recover his early childhood experience and try to figure out what happened to his parents in the Holocaust. We find out that they're both probably victims of the Holocaust, but we find out actually very little about what happened to them. But two things struck me about this novel. One is that it is indeed very multidirectional. And if you've read this, you probably saw this. It's certainly about Jacques Austerlitz and the Holocaust, but it makes connections to all sorts of other histories and histories of violence along the way, and in particular to histories of colonialism and even especially Belgian colonialism. So there's a lot of stuff about the Congo and King Leopold and this sort of thing. So that was one thing that struck me. It is indeed a very multidirectional text, but it's a multidirectional text that is not necessarily based on, again, a shared experience of victimization uniquely. So the other thing that's interesting about Austerlitz is that it's narrated from the perspective of a narrator who very closely seems to resemble Sebald himself. In other words, a German man, non-Jewish, born at the very end of the war. So with no direct memory or certainly participation in the Holocaust, but a kind of familial communal relationship to that. And so I started to think about this figure of the narrator as what I would eventually call an implicated subject. And to give you a little bit of sense what I mean, here's a short passage from the novel. This is when the narrator is visiting the Braindonk fort in Belgium, which was used by the Nazis as a sort of torture center and camp. It's where famously Jean Améry, the Holocaust survivor and writer, was himself tortured, and the narrator mentions that fact here. So he goes into the Fort Braindonk, and he's talking about how he can't really imagine what it must have been like for the victims, for someone like Améry, but this is what he says: when I finally entered the fort itself and glanced through the glass panes of the door on the right into the so-called mess of the SS guards, I could well imagine the sight of the good fathers and dutiful sons from Filzbiburg and Fuhlsbüttel, from the Black Forest and the Bavarian Alps. After all, I had lived among them until my 20th year. In other words, right, as the son of Germans who may well have been perpetrators during the Second World War and Holocaust, Sebald's narrator has a particular relationship to these events, right, which is different from the relationship that a victim might have, or even the victim of a different history. And that resonated with me, and it resonated with my own life, ironically, I suppose, as a Jewish Holocaust survivor. And it led me to this notion of the implicated subject, and it led me to reflect on my own position as a kind of implicated subject. And so this book, I often say, is sort of an autobiographical book, even though you will read it and not find a lot of very personal writing. And what I mean by that is it made me think back to especially discussions I had in my early 20s when I was trying to figure out what my position was as a white Jewish American man in relationship to the founding traumas of the United States, slavery and the genocide of indigenous people. I was obviously not a perpetrator of that. My family immigrated long after slavery ended, after at least the initial sort of genocide of indigenous people happened. What was my relationship to that? I felt that I had a certain kind of responsibility, but I didn't quite have the terms to understand that or reflect on that. And I remember having arguments with other people similar to me, white Jewish guys in their 20s, and they sort of rejecting this idea that this history really implicated them, had anything to do with them. They said, well, you know, my family wasn't here, I'm an immigrant, this isn't my history. And I knew that was wrong. I knew that there was a problem with that, but again, I didn't quite have the vocabulary to describe it. In some ways, many years later, that's what this book is an attempt to do. It's an attempt to go back to those issues and to think through them and to try to provide a kind of vocabulary for them. And again, as a Holocaust scholar, I was able to find resources in the way that people like Sebald, Germans, in fact, had come to respond to their own history. And in a book that was important to me, especially, was this Karl Jaspers' book, The Question of German Guilt. Jaspers was a philosopher writing immediately after, German philosopher writing immediately after the Nazi period and trying to convince his fellow Germans really of the legitimacy of the Nuremberg trials and trying to explain to them the kind of responsibility that they bore for what had just happened. And he made what to me remains a really important distinction between what he called criminal guilt and political guilt. And those were two of four categories. You can see the other ones on the screen that he discusses in this book, but it was particularly those two that were important to me. So criminal guilt is the guilt that arises for individual perpetrators of crimes. If you have committed a crime yourself directly, you are criminally guilty. But what about everybody else, right? What about that mass of Germans whom Jaspers was addressing at that time? For them, he described what he called political guilt, which has to do with your responsibility for membership in a collective, right? Just by virtue of being a citizen, by being a member of a polis, you bear a certain kind of what he called political guilt. Now, that to me was a really important distinction. It remains a really important distinction. I'll keep coming back to that. I follow Hannah Arendt, though, in changing the terminology a little bit, because I think it's a little bit confusing, in fact, to talk about guilt in these instances when you're not talking about, again, direct criminal perpetration. So I prefer the term responsibility for what he calls political guilt. So my book, Implicated Subject, is about what I call historical and political responsibility. Thought for those who are not, again, criminally guilty of crimes, but yet are still somehow entangled in these events. So that leads me to what I call my sort of first thesis about the implicated subject. I've sort of adapted a few of these from the book itself. And what I came to see is that we lacked precisely a vocabulary for talking about this kind of historical and political responsibility, which is why it was so hard for me to make that argument about my responsibility in relation to slavery and genocide in the US context. So my first argument is we need to enlarge our understanding of the actors involved in injustices beyond the most often invoked figures of victims, perpetrators, and bystanders. And so I offer a few key terms and a few key arguments that I hope will help us to sort through these different kinds of responsibility. And I offer this notion, especially of the implicated subject, the one who inherits a history of violence, like you saw with Zabal, like in my own experience, but also the one who enables or benefits from histories of violence and exploitation, or even perpetuates them in indirect ways, right? So the key point here is that the implicated subject is not a perpetrator because they are not criminally guilty and not directly participating in these histories, but they're also not a bystander. Bystander for me is a very weak term because it implies a kind of detachment and passivity. And I'm trying to think about different ways in which we are in fact entangled in histories, even if it's not always directly. I emphasize that this is not an identity, right? To be an implicated subject is not a kind of ontological, given once and for all identity. It's rather a position, a subject position. And one of the things that means is that we occupy multiple subject positions, right? In relationship to different histories, in relationship to different structures of inequality. We're not situated always in the same way, and those relations shift, and those histories change, and those structures shift. So this is not a one time you're frozen forever in a particular place, but it's about the particular responsibilities that we have in relationship to different kinds of histories. I also use the word implication along with implicated subject to mean the way that we are precisely folded into. These are thinking of the etymology, implicare, the way we're folded into different events and structures. And the etymology, as you can see, is very close, of course, to complicity. And there's I think, a discussion that we could have later if anyone is interested about the relationship between implication and complicity. I draw here, though, on Mark Sanders, who's written an important book about complicity in the South African context. And one of my ultimate arguments is that although the implicated subject is not a perpetrator, the implicated subject is a transmission belt of domination. In other words, implicated subjects play essential parts in histories of violence, in structures of inequality and exploitation as a kind of transmission belt. And there I borrow from a really wonderful book by the Italian philosopher Simona Forti called New Demons, where she's trying to come up with a notion of evil that is not demonic, but in some ways very mediocre. So and that kind of mediocrity, I think, is important to thinking about this question. So a couple of just subsequent parts of the argument before I get into some examples taken from the art world. For me, this question of implication and implicated subjects works on two axes. I think we're implicated in dilemmas of responsibility that are historical, right, in terms of historical legacies. Again, think about Zabal, think about me in relationship to slavery. I call this diachronic implication, the kinds of histories that we inherit responsibility for. But at the same time, I think we're also implicated in various contemporary histories of violence, contemporary forms of inequality. Think about sweatshop labor, the clothes that we buy, right, which are produced somewhere far away, and by people we will never see or know, and yet we are implicated in those relations of exploitation. Or think about climate change, right? I wouldn't talk about our consumption as making us perpetrators of climate change or climate crisis, but we are implicated in these larger processes nonetheless that are unfolding in the present. I call that synchronic implication. As I said a moment ago, I think that we are often situated in different ways in relationship to different histories. So I talk about what I call complex implication. I mean that in a slightly technical sense. When I talk about complex implication, and I'll give an example in a moment, I'm talking about people who have lines of connection both to histories of victimization and to histories of perpetration. And I think that's actually a very common and actually very important form of implication. And I think it's behind a lot of the difficult conflicts and struggles that we sometimes have over political issues. Like take Israel-Palestine, for example, where I think for Israelis, you have certainly a very intimate connection to a history of victimization, and yet at the same time, you have an occupation going on, right? And so how do you balance those two things? How do you bring those things together? To me, that's an example of what I call complex implication.
Michael,
So,
I don't want to interrupt, but
yeah.
your microphone is bouncing around.
Oh, okay.
So the audio is somehow
Okay,
uncut.
sorry.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to be less energetic in my.
It's hard.
I apologize. Okay, so I want to come then to the third part of the talk and start to bring in the question of art. And Sabina had asked me specifically to talk about art, since this is a museum context, obviously, and it is an important part of my work. So what is it that art makes possible? What are the possibilities of art in relationship to, especially the question of the implicated subject and implication? I think that art helps us to make visible our implication in histories that seem at first to be distant from us temporally, or distant from us geographically, right? My argument is that we're folded into these histories that we often can't even necessarily see, or can choose not to see, or choose not to know, and yet which we still play significant roles. And so art helps us to see that, and art has both cognitive and affective powers that are relevant here. Art can teach us and inform us on the one hand, but it also moves us affectively. And I think that's also that emotional, affective dimension of art, I think, is also very important in getting us to feel how we are perhaps implicated in histories that seem far from us. But as both of the artists that I hope to talk about today, William Kentridge and Hito Steyrl, show us, art is itself also implicated in various institutions, right? So art is also itself an example of what implication can mean. So let me show you what I mean by this. And I want to talk then for a few minutes first about Kentridge, and if there is time, I'll talk a little bit about Steyrl as well. So Kentridge is a South African Jewish artist who does a lot with drawing and a lot with film. And I've been especially interested in this series of handmade animated films that he's been doing for quite a while, that he calls Drawings for Projections. It's a whole series of short films. They're usually 5, 8, 9 minutes long, so they take quite a long time to actually make. And the first one was made in 1989. And just to give you a sense historically of what that means, 1990 was the year that Mandela was let out of jail, that the ANC was legalized, and that South Africa's transition out of apartheid began. But 89, things were starting to happen. And in this series of films, especially the early ones made in the early 90s, Kentridge is really tracking South Africa's transition. And he's doing it, he does it through this story of a kind of love triangle, at least that's the way it starts, between Soho Eckstein, his wife known as Mrs. Eckstein in the film, and Felix Teitelbaum. And what's interesting is that both Soho and Felix are alter egos in a sense of the artist, and they're kind of modeled on him. And in fact, the older he gets, the more he starts to look like Soho as he goes. I think originally he was using his grandfather as the model for that. And so I see these films as, among other things, a kind of a reflection on the implication of the white South African and sometimes South African Jewish subject in relationship to apartheid and in relationship to the kind of revolutionary historical change that is starting to happen in this moment in the early 90s. So for example, here you see Felix. Again, he's always naked in all of the films, and he's there with Mrs. Eckstein. They're having an affair. And so betrayal is kind of a theme. And they're looking on as a mass demonstration goes by. You can kind of see a red flag there. And I think what he's trying to, I think this is stronger than just saying Felix is a bystander. I think it's a kind of indictment of the passivity, again, of the implicated bystander. And that's what Felix often stands for, at least in my reading of a film like this. I now want to turn a little bit in more detail to a film called Mine, which concerns Soho. And so Soho, we come to learn, is a mining magnate, a kind of industrial magnate. And in this film, we see him, as you'll see in a moment, we see Soho in a kind of domestic space, but then we also see the mines. And what I'm interested here is both the way that Kentridge uses multidirectionality, you'll see, or I'll try to explain, it's a very multidirectional film in terms of the memories and histories that it evokes, but also to think about the question of implication. Soho is himself in some ways a perpetrator, I would say, or certainly directly responsible for some of what's happening, but he's also implicated in other histories the film suggests. But especially what I'm interested in is why would Kentridge kind of stage himself through this particular alter ego of Soho? And you'll see what I hope you'll see what I mean as we go. So I'm gonna show a brief clip from Mine, about a minute or so long, and let me just get this going, and the sound should come through. If it doesn't, Sabine, please let me know. Okay, great. Okay, great. I hope that you were able to see that and to hear the music as well. So what happens here? So Soho is in his bed. He smoking a cigar. The smoke turns into a bell. He rings for his breakfast. His coffee is brought. He plunges the plunger on his French press, or what Kentridge calls cafetiere. The plunger doesn't only go through the coffee pot, but it goes under the coffee pot, it goes through the floor, it goes into the mines themselves, it goes through the head of a sleeping miner. As you can see here, blood starts to flow. As the plunger goes further, it starts to create sparks in the rock of the mine, and an image appears, which you probably will quickly recognize as this famous image of a slave ship. And you start to wonder what's going on here. What are these other histories that are being evoked? If you're a Holocaust scholar at that point, you also start to get very suspicious about images like this, which in fact seem to be modeled fairly directly on this famous image from the liberation of Buchenwald. It's an image that in fact contains a young Elie Wiesel. So if you see that again, now Kentridge says he wasn't thinking about the Holocaust when he made this film, but for those of us who might see that first association with the barracks, you might also start to think about the showers, right? And what's going on here. And a kind of, to me at least, a fairly clear Holocaust reference, as well as that reference to slavery. So you start out with a mining magnate. You then have evoked this longer, deeper history of slavery, and then this kind of other history at an angle to it, which is the history of the Holocaust. And given the fact that Soho seems to have a kind of Jewish name, to be modeled on Kentridge himself and Kentridge's family, you start to wonder about what that's doing there. And so it's a complicated, it's actually quite a complicated film and a complicated issue to sort of unpack, especially in a short time here. But I guess what interests me here is both this prevalence of a kind of multidirectional memory, And then this question of what it means not only to be directly responsible for a history, like we might say that Soho is for what's happened, the exploitation in the mine, but also how he's implicated in this longer history of slavery. And then what is his relationship, his more complex relationship to the history of the Holocaust as well, a kind of Jewish inheritance of suffering, which is juxtaposed with this history of slavery and the exploitation of Black workers in South Africa. And this notion of implication is, I think, quite widespread in Kentridge's work. And we see it also in a film like Felix in Exile, where he develops what I would call a kind of like post-humanist form of implication as well, or ecological implication is maybe even a better way of saying it, where he depicts again and again this sort of devastated landscape of the East Rand around Johannesburg where he lives, devastated by mining, right? This is a landscape that has been really destroyed and disfigured by mining. And the way that Felix kind of immerses himself in this landscape here, to me, is again, raises questions about what it means for us to be implicated in ecological devastation, something like ecological, what I would call ecological implication. I want to try to end soon, I think, because it's been already about a half hour. I did want to mention the latest film in this series that Kentridge just released last month is a beautiful film called City Deep that takes place in and around the Johannesburg Art Gallery. So this is a film that is really directly about museums, but what's interesting is that it's also a film about mining once again and about memory. So he's returned after close to 30 years to some of the thematics of that earlier film, Mine, by juxtaposing mining and memory, and Soho once again as a much older figure. And but what's interesting is that the form of mining that he's exploring now has changed quite a bit. It's no longer this industrial form where Soho is the owner, but it's what's called in South Africa Zama Zama mining, means something like take a chance. And it's a sort of informal, illegal economy in which people are mining the remnants of that, again, devastated mining landscape on a kind of very informal basis. And so you see that on the right side there, and Soho as he kind of looks into this very shallow mining pit. The film is also exploring, I think, the way that art itself is implicated in different forms of violence, even more directly, I think, than in the earlier films. So you see that the mining landscape itself becomes a work of art that is displayed in the Johannesburg Art Gallery. If you know a little bit about the history, you know that the Johannesburg Art Gallery was actually founded and funded by mining magnates at the beginning of the 20th century. So there's in fact a very direct connection between the exploitation happening in the mines and the display of art in the museum itself. And I see the film as kind of, again, reflecting on Soho's individual memory, but connecting it to larger questions of collective responsibility and to the institutions of cultural memory like the museum. And the film made me think of this great essay by Aleida Osman, a leading scholar in memory studies, called Canon and Archive, where she's discussing different modes of what she calls cultural memory, which is a kind of canonical memory of the past associated with great works of art and literature and religion and history. And she writes that, these two modes of cultural memory, canon and archive, may be illustrated by different rooms of the museum. The museum presents its prestigious objects to the viewers in representative shows which are arranged to catch attention and make a lasting impression. The same museum also houses storerooms stuffed with other paintings and objects in peripheral spaces, such as cellars and attics, which are not publicly presented. What struck me about this new film by Kentridge, and I'm still thinking about it because it's really brand new, is that it seems to collapse all of that into the mine itself. And so at the very end of the film, what you see is that the museum literally just falls apart. So you see on the left that the mining, this sort of mining hole is now all of a sudden situated within the museum. In the museum, literally the walls collapse, the art falls from the walls, and what you're left with is this kind of merging of the mining landscape and the museum landscape. And I guess I see that as, again, an indication of the way that cultural memory, including especially art and high art, kind of collapse into the conditions of exploitation that lie literally, in this case, right underneath them. It reminds me of this famous statement by Walter Benjamin: there is no document of culture which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. And I think I read it as a kind of continuing reflection by Kentridge on the role of art in a society which remains incredibly unequal, and in fact, in some ways is even more unequal than it was during the earlier transitional period, where the promise of democracy and equality has not been fulfilled, right? But things are in fact just kind of falling apart, and these relations of exploitation and inequality persist. I think instead of sort of going through this last section, I should maybe stop at this point, since it's been, I think, well over a half hour. But I'll just say what I would talk about here is this, and what I talk about in my book, in the last section of my book, is sort of the big question: what is to be done, right? What do we do about implication? I offer implication as a kind of analytical tool for understanding our responsibility and entanglement in violence, in inequality and exploitation, but it's not therefore a good thing, right? It's something that we want to transform and transfigure, as I say. And one of the important ways that I think we do that is by thinking about solidarity in new ways, and thinking especially about solidarity across different subject positions, right? Across different locations, what I call long distance solidarity, or sometimes differentiated solidarity. And in the book, I was inspired in particular by this social media campaign that rose up after George Zimmerman, the murderer of Trayvon Martin, was declared innocent in his trial, and a lot of people were kind of arguing, you know, or kind of becoming active under the slogan, "We are all Trayvon Martin. I am Trayvon Martin. We are Trayvon Martin." This campaign arose, "We are not Trayvon Martin." And I thought that was a really important intervention, actually, because it suggests to me that solidarity does not have to take place through identification, right? That it actually can recognize that we are not all situated in the same way in relationship to structural racism, for example, especially if we are white, but that we can still be in solidarity with those who are the victims of those kinds of structures. And I also then trace that through an interesting ongoing project by the German artist Hito Steyrl, where she is kind of reflecting on her relationship to the struggle between Turkey and the Kurdish independence and autonomous movement. And I could say a little bit more about that if we want. It also ends up having to do also with the question of the museum and the way that the museum is implicated in violence as well. But I think I'll stop there and open, because I'm sure there's, or I hope that at least that there's enough to talk about at this point, and I don't want to monopolize it.
Thank you so much, Michael, for this wonderful lecture, very rich. I want to turn it over to Anika immediately. We are a little bit over time, as you already mentioned, and have Anika ask you some questions she had prepared, but I would also encourage the public immediately to post questions on the Q&A, and I will be watching that as well. Anika, it's yours.
Right, thank you, Sabine. And thank you, of course, Michael, for just this very, very rich presentation. I think I have about 15 questions that I would like to ask, which I will not do, so never fear. Sorry. But yeah, I also want to really encourage our audience members to post questions, because we really want this to have to become a public conversation. So I think my first question really goes to the heart of your book, which is about the implicated subject, which I think you've made very clear in this presentation and in the book as well. You describe as a subject position, not an identity. But I, of course, wonder, and I'm struggling with that still a little bit. I've been working through your book for quite a while now. Can we actually separate those two elements completely? Because I actually don't think we can. Because in many ways, the subject position that we take on, and speaking from my perspective as a white woman living in the United States of America, right. My subject position toward the history of slavery, toward the history of racism in this country is, of course, determined by this very identity. So I wanted you to elaborate a little bit more on that. How can we actually separate that? Can we do that? But of course, what does that mean for any kind of project that we might want to develop to overcome those legacies of implication and injustice?
Right. I think that's a really great question. Actually, I've been thinking about it also myself and reflecting back on my own formulation. It struck me actually as I was thinking about Sebald for this particular project, because in some sense what Sebald is saying is I'm born into this history, right? And that's true. So how is that how is that a subject position and not an identity? I think that's a totally legitimate question. And I'll say right from the start, of course, I think you're right that these are very intimately connected. And yet I think it's still necessary to create a little space between them, right? To make a kind of distinction and for different reasons. One of them is because, again, I think by talking about subject positions instead of identities, we do draw attention to our the way we're multiply situated, right? So, you know, again, as a white woman, you are situated differently than I am as a white man, right? As a white woman born in place X, you are situated differently than I am as a white man in place Y or what have you. So I think that's important to emphasize. And I think that for me, at least, the notion of subject position is a way of getting at that multiplicity of sometimes contradictory locations that we occupy. I think you're right that in some sense, you know, and again, the Sebald kind of example or our own example as white people living in the US also suggests is, yeah, there's a very strong sense in which these are not, when I say subject position, I don't mean that this is something that's chosen or voluntary, right? In some sense, it is not, or in very real senses, it is not chosen. In a sense, we are either born into it or we move into it, we migrate into it, right? I think that's actually interesting as well. And you know that I'm also interested in that question of migration and how when you migrate into a new context, you take on new kinds of responsibilities. So I think that's also true. But I guess, and I agree that that part of what I'm trying to address is a form of social determination, right? Again, we can't choose to be or not be part of these histories. That's certainly not my argument. But I guess what I want to emphasize is that they are histories and they are structures, and histories and structures can change or do change and can be changed. And so if there's going to be a chance for transformation, I think we have to create a little bit of space between a kind of, at least a very fixed notion of identity and a somewhat more flexible notion that I would associate with a concept like subject position. I agree with you, and I think I agree with you very much, but I guess what I'm trying to get at in making that distinction or trying to encourage is that we don't fall into fixed notions of identity, and that we are aware of the ways that identities can in fact be transformed and need to be transformed. But as you say, that's not an easy process and it's not a quick process. And I'm not convinced at all that we're ever going to get out quickly or easily from some of these determining identities, such as whiteness, for example. But yet we still have to believe that some sort of transformation is possible, because I think that enables political action, I suppose.
Sure.
Anika, there's one question which connects a little bit to this discussion. So can I just insert that question? So Carla Velasquez asked, my question is, within your analysis, do you consider whether there may be a personal decision regarding implications? Can a subject choose to get implicated in specific stories, even if those stories are not immediately associated with their daily life? So that maybe also brings it to the individual.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And actually, in some ways, that is, I think, partly what Hito Steirl's project is about. It started out as a film and then has multiple films and performances and all sorts of things that she's done. And it started out as a reflection on a close friend of hers named Andrea Wolf, a German woman who was involved in the extreme left in Germany, and then at a certain point went and joined the PKK, the Kurdish militant independence movement. And so that is in some ways an example of somebody really making a very radical decision to become implicated in a history which seems very far from her own. And Steirl in her project is initially a little bit skeptical, or I didn't even say a lot skeptical about what her friend has done. Her friend dies, in fact, in a battle with the Turkish army as a member of the women's group of the PKK. And Steyrl is kind of skeptical about this, sees it as a kind of romantic internationalism, right? Why has she gone off and done this, entered this struggle that is not her own? But as she continues this project, she herself, Hito, the artist, gets more and more drawn into it, and starts to take on, I think, some of the kinds of some of the kind of solidarity work that her friend had done, not the armed militant kind exactly, but still a kind of humanitarian, human rights-based internationalist solidarity. And she ended up a couple of years ago in Rojava, right, the Kurdish autonomous zone, working with women artists and women fighters who were involved in the Kurdish struggle. And so, yes, I think sometimes these sort of radical acts of solidarity can be examples of people choosing, in a sense, to become implicated. I think, though, what Steyrl would also say, though, and what she shows in this project is that actually, while this is on the one hand a choice, she's also in some ways really implicated as a German, for example. So she draws attention to the way that Germany is supplying weapons to the Turkish army, which are then being used to kill her friend, right, to fight against the Kurds. And what she eventually shows is that the very museums that display her work about this in this project are themselves funded by some of the military contractors who again produced the weapons who killed her friend. So she kind of reveals this complicated story or history of implication in which she ends up finding herself, even though at first it seems like a very kind of personal voluntaristic choice. And I guess that's, for me, what's important about the concept of implication is the way it allows us to see how individuals are, again, sort of tied into, entangled with larger histories and structures that we don't see at first. And so I think the individual really matters, both in the way we're implicated and the way we can resist that implication. But it also matters because it shows us these larger histories and these larger structures that we don't always see or perceive.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I would actually like to pick up on this thread that we just opened between implication and solidarity, because I think, as you described, they're very, very closely related. Yeah. Because, of course, implication does not have to be solidarity, right? It does not have to result in solidarity. No. And if you really look at the definition that you develop of the implicated subject, it really is about the enablers, the beneficiaries, and the perpetuators of violence and injustice, right? And not those who fight against it. No. So to be in solidarity is a choice. That really, I think, is a choice to overcome that implication. Right. And so my question kind of picks up a little bit on what you said earlier in the response to the first question about social determination. And that is very closely related with what brings me to this conversation, which is Jeff Ward and my project to develop a so-called studio lab called Memory for the Future, which is where we really try to use your concept of multidirectional memory to develop new forms of humanities education, but also practical public history. Very concretely, this means that it's going to be a year-long program for graduate students here to essentially practice public humanities. So to combine classroom education about histories of the Holocaust, slavery, apartheid, and colonialism with kind of more practical work around practices of remembrance and learning from the past. So there'll be major internship parts, which we will use to bring students in contact and collaboration with, for instance, the Griot History of Black History here in St. Louis, but also the local Holocaust Museum and the Missouri History Society, so that they kind of get a broad range of how can we deal with the past and how can we bring it into the present. But of course, we call the Studio Lab Memory for the Future. So we don't want to only look backwards. We actually want to think about a society that we want to build. We want to create a vision for our history, that for a society that overcomes these histories of hierarchy and violence. And so one of the questions that I think especially Jeff was interested for today is actually how can we as universities, as institutions that are actually implicated in these histories of violence, of injustice, how can we as institutions actually contribute to building something new? And I think that kind of comes back to what you said earlier about identity and implication, where we have a pretty diverse student body at this point with students of very different identities. and also very different implications.
Right.
But at the same time, we're working within the institutional framework. So how can we grapple with that? And it is a serious question that we're trying to kind of deal with in that project.
I mean, I think that's the big, I mean, it's a wonderful question and even more wonderful project. And I'm excited about what you guys are doing and excited to see how it goes forward and would love to participate in any way that I could. I mean, I don't know that there's any easy answer, I guess I would say. And I think we have to work on multiple fronts and probably at multiple levels. I think the classroom, I don't see the classroom as a space for, certainly for indoctrination of any kind. I don't do explicit politics in the classroom. And yet I think what we do is to offer tools to our students that can help them to grasp the, the kinds of intersecting histories that we're interested in, and to try to get them to experience for themselves or to discover for themselves the way these things intersect and the way that they are situated in relationship to them. And so I do think that, I do think that the concept of multidirectional memory lends itself nicely both to pedagogical projects and to museum projects, because I hope at least that it can push us to go again. I think it has to do a little bit with going beyond maybe our comfort zones or out of our comfort zones, and to think about collaborations and to think about how we can bring different questions to bear on each other. And I think probably that is best done collaboratively, right? So I'm involved in a program we have here at UCLA called the Cluster Program, which are large team-taught interdisciplinary courses for first-year students on kind of large topics. And the one that I helped to develop and I'm teaching now for the second time is called Political Violence in the Modern World. And what we've done is each year we've taken 3 case studies and kind of over 2 quarters, sort of present them together, both the actual histories of violence and then the aftermaths of violence, where we talk about questions like justice and legal, the law, memory, testimony, trauma, these sorts of things. And in the first year, our 3 cases were the Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, and the mass violence in Indonesia in the mid-1960s. This year, we substituted the Armenian genocide for the Rwandan genocide, and we have a new colleague teaching with us. And I think it's these kinds of conversations that we can promote and should promote. There's no particular agenda associated with that project, at least, right? It's just certainly not a political one. It's to think, but it is, there's a hope that by thinking these events together, I think we can also reflect on our own positions and also reflect a bit on what's going on. And you'll sometimes find uncanny echoes, right, from these histories in our own history. And so when I was lecturing last week or a couple of weeks ago on Nazi Germany in the 1930s, bringing up the connections between Nazi racial policy and Nazi racial law and racial law in the United States, right, which we now know the Nazis were actively studying. And to think about the relationship between a pogrom or something like Kristallnacht and the lynchings that were going on in the United States at this time, not to collapse these into each other and to say these are the same history, but to show that they're actually interconnected in very real material ways. They're not even just analogous, they're actually connected. So I think it's, we have an opportunity as educators and cultural workers to kind of make those intersections more visible and to break through the kind of disciplinary logic, and I think the logic of uniqueness, which to me is a big problem. Not because I don't think the Holocaust is very specific in particular and different from just about all other histories, but because despite those differences, despite those particularities, I think there's something to be gained by juxtaposition and relationality. So, that doesn't, I don't know if that gets at that doesn't really get at all of your questions, but it's sort of the way I start to think about it, at least. And I guess so that's multidirectionality. I guess with implicated subject, what I would hope to kind of add into that conversation is the asymmetrical relationships that we all have to these different histories. That's one of the big points I want to bring across, is that we're not all situated in the same way in relationship to the history of the Holocaust, the history of lynching and segregation in the United States, et cetera, et cetera. As you say, our student bodies and the publics for museums are incredibly diverse. And so we can't tell a story that is a unitary story that's going to mean the same thing to everybody. But we can get people to be, I guess, self-reflexive about how they are related to, in different ways, to these different histories. And I do think self-reflexivity, self-reflection is not enough, but I do think it's necessary. And so it's not sufficient, but it's a necessary part of, I say, being a citizen in a democratic country, but also of establishing solidarity if you're interested in being part of social movements, right? You have to reflect on your own position and not sort of blindly leap into things. And that itself can be valuable.
Great. Just very briefly, because I think we have a number of questions in the chat. That brings me back to a conversation we had just 2 days ago. We had a big Holocaust Memorial Lecture event here. One of our panelists, Howard During, really called on museums to rethink the notion of an exhibition, but to really think about themselves as more of a site of encounter. So being much more engaged actually with the visiting community, and to create kind of to really rethink the institution. And I think that is certainly big and complex agenda, but I think it's definitely something to think about, and that we are kind of trying to think with as we're developing the Studio Lab. We really want to forge these local collaborations, but which of course take place in a much larger context of a variety of ideas. So again, I have a lot of other questions, but Sabine, did you identify any other questions?
But there's one just connected to this, so why don't we will not, I have to say it's 12 minutes past 1 o'clock here in America, or in Central American, in the Central American time zone. So we will not get through all questions, but there may be 2 or 3 we can still address, Michael, if that's okay.
Sure, I'm happy to keep going, yeah.
Okay, so one directly connected to this discussion which we just had. If you would realize your projects in a museum, what would it be and how would you do it?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer the question. I think that's for you, Sabina, perhaps. You know, I'm not a museum professional. I don't really have curating experience. I do see my I mean, I'm an educator for sure, and so I just described a little bit what I think might be important pedagogically. You know, I see my main role though as offering some concepts that I hope people can use in different contexts. So I think in some ways, I guess I feel like it's not that hard to imagine how multi-directional memory could be instantiated in a museum, right? So you could indeed have exhibits on, you know, different racial regimes in the 1930s, right? And certainly it would be easy to connect the US and Germany and South Africa, for example, and probably a lot of other places as well. And so it's relatively easy for me to imagine how you might do that, because there are real, again, not just analogies, which can sometimes be fruitful, but also real material interconnections, connections of people, of ideas that are traveling. And I think we could try to bring more visibility to that sort of thing. I think the harder question is how you link that to the question of implication, right? How do you get people to see, to not just sort of, oh, appreciate this interesting history or these interesting histories that you've brought out and that you're exhibiting, but to think about how they themselves are, again, implicated in those histories, and sometimes bear certain responsibilities for them. That is, I think, a harder question. And honestly, again, I don't feel that I necessarily have the answer. I do think that, you know, again, works of art, works of literature have this kind of affective power to reach us, to unsettle us. And I think that maybe part of our role, again, as educators and as museum professionals and other kinds of cultural workers, is, yeah, not to provide easy answers, not to provide easily consumable exhibits, but to challenge people, to try to get them to understand and to feel, again, their own implication. But that's a tricky thing, and it runs risks because it's easy to produce resentment and defensive reactions against that. And as a concept, one of my hopes is that this notion of implication and implicated subjects helps us to get out of some of those defensive, resentful responses, because again, just to make it clear, right, I'm not saying we are guilty of slavery, right? There's a difference between being guilty and being responsible. And I think when people feel guilty, they respond in a defensive way. But if we can get people to see that we're actually talking about something else. We're not saying you did this, right? We're saying you're part of this. You may have actually benefited from it also. This again gets harder for people to understand, but it's sort of like, I think, creating this space where it's not about trying to make people feel guilty or I think shamed either, though there are people who are also, I know people who are kind of working with this notion of implication and trying to actually argue that guilt and shame can be important affects. I'm not so sure that that's true, but I think we need to think more about it. But like, what are the kinds of emotions and affects that we want to provoke that we think actually might activate people, get them to understand their position in the histories, and then of course also try to do something about them?
Well, there's certainly also the issue, I think, at least in an art museum, of how far can you go with these affect,
Sure.
sometimes radically,
Yeah.
affect creating or
Yeah.
raising artworks.
Yeah.
How provocative can you be without hurting the feelings
Right.
of people as well? So it's
Yeah.
sometimes a tricky, fine line.
Absolutely.
Where do you stop? How far can you go?
Right.
I don't know.
I feel that as a
Typically in
teacher
relation
too.
to the Holocaust, there are a lot of works which are,
Right.
really very radical in the way they create affect.
Sure.
So we do have one other, I mean, Annika, we'll get there. I don't know if you want to choose another question. There's one very provocative question in the Q&A. And since Michael touched upon this connection, I would
Please go ahead.
selected. It is, since we're just talking about provocative and very difficult issues, it is certainly one of them. Could you comment on the role of trauma and Holocaust memory in the Israeli occupation of Palestine, in which state violence is systematically directed against the indigenous Palestinian population displaced in 1948? So.
Yeah, I mean, there's a chapter of my book on this very question. It's called From Gaza to Warsaw, and it investigates these kind of very common analogies and comparisons that are often made between the Holocaust and the Israeli occupation and dispossession of Palestinians. And I wrote that, again, that was one of the earliest pieces I wrote for this book, and wrote it soon after I finished Multidirectional Memory. Again, when I was thinking about the question that people were posing to me, well, okay, multidirectional memory, but is all multidirectional memory the same, and is it always a good thing? And my answer is no, it's not always the same, and it's not always a good thing, and that there are forms of connection that can be kind of disturbing at times, and even ones that we certainly would not censor, but that we might not want to affirm. And so in order to try to work that out, what I call an ethics of comparison, I chose what for me is the most difficult of all the cases, which is precisely this kind of Israeli occupation Holocaust analogy. And I try to, what I try to do is to go through a series of examples and show that we can make distinctions, and that these distinctions are important ethically and politically. And so I certainly don't think that it's inadmissible as such to make that connection and make that comparison, but I think how we make it matters, right? And so I developed this, again, what I call an ethics of comparison, in which I kind of try to map out these different versions of multidirectionality across two axes, one that goes from equation of histories toward radical differentiation of histories, and then another, what I call the axis of political affect, that goes from competition to solidarity. And I ask, when you make a comparison between anything, but let's stick with our case, Israeli policy, the Holocaust, are you equating these different histories? Are you radically separating them? Or are you creating a kind of relationality? And then I ask, why are you doing this? Are you doing this to kind of pit different victims against each other, or to create new forms, new bonds and new forms of solidarity? And if you map them across these two axes, you get these sort of 4 quadrants. And the one that I particularly value, and it's closest to my own politics, is the sort of quadrant that I call differentiated solidarity. And the idea there is that you can bring together different histories of violence without collapsing them into each other, right? That you can maintain their distinctiveness while still putting them in relationship. And that you do that not, again, to kind of take part in a competition of victims, but in fact to kind of try to create new forms of solidarity. And in the book, the kind of model that I use to think through this is, again, an artwork by Alan Schechner, who's a British Jewish artist, also, I believe, served in the Israeli army at a certain point. And he's one of these very provocative Holocaust artists who's done some pretty wild stuff. But this is I think, to me, this is a really powerful piece. It's called The Legacy of Abused Children. It's a video loop in which what you first see is the famous image of the Warsaw Ghetto boy, right? The boy holding his hands up like this. It's actually a Nazi produced image, a perpetrator image. And the video starts to zoom in on the Warsaw Ghetto boy, and you see that in his hand, he's holding a photograph. And as you zoom in on the photograph, you realize that it's a photograph of a young Palestinian boy who's being arrested by Israeli military or Israeli police, and in fact has wet his pants out of fear in that very moment. And then the loop continues and it zooms in on the Palestinian boy. And then at a certain point, you see he's holding a photograph as well. It's a photograph of the Warsaw Ghetto boy, and it zooms in on that, and then the loop kind of continues. So to me, it's a kind of beautiful image. I mean, I don't know, beautiful might not be the word. It's got, I'm not saying it's unproblematic or perfect in any way, but it's clearly done in the interest of solidarity. It may move toward equating these very different histories. I kind of can feel like I can argue a little bit against that. But it's interested in the way that we are responsible for the history of the other, I guess, that we are implicated in it and responsible for it. And so that's sort of the way I would address that question and say, again, this for me is a case of what I call complex implication. That Israelis do have connections to a history of victimization, which is very real, but that doesn't absolve them in any way from responsibility for what's going on in Gaza or the occupied territories, or even within Israel itself, in terms of the inequality of Palestinian citizens. So, I think we need to think these things together, but the one does not erase or absolve the other one.
Okay, Annika, would you want to ask the last question? There's many, I know we have many, many questions left.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that one of the questions that talks specifically about William Kentridge's art was quite interesting, because I think we are talking within the framework.
Get back to that.
I always love to talk about Kentridge.
Right.
Right. So the question really was, do you think whether the specific medium of filmmaking lends itself specifically to the multiple inscriptions of histories of the Holocaust and of the complicity of white South Africans? And Elke Heckner, who posed that question, specifically referred to the fact that the style of filmmaking that Kentridge produces here draws almost exclusively on etchings and drawings, so resonating with a number of different kinds of artist productions, such as Kate Koiwitz's, but it also makes very concrete statements about the possibilities and limits of visual representation. And I'm really quoting the question.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. Thank you, Elke. Yes, I mean, the medium in which Kentridge works is incredibly important. And he works in a lot of different media, actually, but just to think about the drawings for projection, they're particularly suggestive. And of course, I do talk about this a lot in my work on Kentridge. It's harder to do it live like this in a short format. What's really remarkable about his work is he's developed really his own medium in a certain sense, which is based on drawing and erasing, right? So what he does is he has a sheet of paper, he draws using this kind of charcoal on it, takes a couple of shots with his movie camera, goes back to the paper, starts erasing and smudging and adding to the image, takes a couple of more shots, goes back to the paper, smudges, erases, draws some more. And so you get this ongoing process in which you literally see the layers of images on top of each other. and you also see the way that certain images get erased and smudged. And so it's very, very suggestive for thinking about memory and the way that memories overwrite each other, and some fade and others, maybe seem to take their place, but that we nevertheless can kind of see multiple, multiple moments are preserved at the same time on the page. And it's especially beautiful. He does this thing very frequently with movement. It could be a person walking, and it's often a person walking and bearing a heavy load. It's one of the things that he shows a lot. He's very interested in processions, and sort of processions of, like, could be a death dance, or kind of processions of the poor and impoverished carrying, again, these heavy load burdens on their backs, or sometimes also with animals, like with a bird flying across the sky. And because of this drawing, smudging, erasing technique that he uses, you see traces of the movement as a kind of tail behind the person who's moving. And so again, he's getting us to see how time is not, I think, not just a kind of empty continuum, right? It's Walter Benjamin's ideas from Theses on, or on the concept of history, I think are again very resonant here, because we don't move through homogeneous empty time. Time is layered. It includes erasures, it includes traces of other histories. And he's showing us both how those histories can get forgotten through erasure, histories of violence in particular. But I think his art kind of excavates those lost and forgotten histories and brings them back to our attention precisely through this particular medium of the kind of drawing for projection, as he calls it. So I think it's a really powerful way of thinking about how histories of violence can lead to erasures and forgettings, but works of art can take part in a kind of process of excavation that brings both those lost histories into view and the erasure into view as well, because the erasure of the history is part of the violence also, it seems to suggest to me, right? When the bodies disappear and when the society tries to forget, that is itself a kind of violence, as we often say about, denial of genocide. And he's able to show that and yet also give us some trace of the history at the same time.
Thank you so very much. Annika, do you have one last question? Otherwise, we would really thank you for also spending so much more time with us, for a wonderful, rich and complex lecture. And I think for a very interesting discussion in which many people, apparently from around the world, as I see it, participated. That's a wonderful Saturday. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Pleasure to be
Michael.
here.
Thanks. Yes.